Did you know that Entry Hazard is a complete fan term and has never actually been used canonically in the Pokemon universe? The official term is Trap, and it describes the field conditions like spikes and stealth rock that have some sort of effect on a Pokemon entering battle. This and many other similar terms were what I discussed in my Canonical Pokémon Fan Terms video, which I recommend you check out. Since the Pokemon community is so wide and diverse though, there were a lot of terms that I missed out on which many of you commented, so here are some more terminology used by the Pokemon community and the official terms to go along with them, if there are official terms. I will only be focusing on the English terminology, as that is my native language, but will still mention some of the Japanese terminology where applicable, since not only is Japan the origin of the franchise, but I am half Japanese myself, so it's the only other language I would be comfortable discussing. If you speak any other languages though, I'd be very interested to see how the terminology differs. In the last video, I mentioned how I'll discuss what terms I prefer to use out of the fan terms and the official terms, but for this video, I'm going to say right away that 9 times out of 10, I prefer the fan terms. I am a fan, and naturally as fans, if there's a concept in the game that we're referring to, or a group of Pokemon that share certain characteristics, or a specific mechanic that doesn't already have a name, we put labels on them so that it's easier to talk about them. As fans, we'll call them whatever makes sense to call them due to our experiences with that concept, or the shared characteristics of the group, or the purpose behind a mechanic. Once they are given official names after we've already created our own names in our minds and in our fan-based communities, it just feels weird. It's Big Pikachu telling us what we can and can't say about this game that we love, since those labels that we put on certain concepts are deemed incorrect and not the proper terminology. Anyway, for the terms I will be discussing, I'll be separating them out into fan terms with official names and fan terms without official names, discussing what the term means and any relevant history the term has. Starting off with fan terms that do have official names, we have the term base stats. This is a fan term that refers to the inherent values unique to each species of Pokemon for their HP, attack, defense, special defense, and speed, which range from 1 to 255 for any one stat and will all add up to their base stat total. You heard me correctly, base stats and base stat total when referring to these numbers are fan terms. The official term is species strengths, and here's why that's worse. Strengths implies that something is strong to begin with, which is unnecessarily specific to describe these numbers since they can absolutely be low as well. Like, it doesn't make sense to say that Slowpoke's species strengths for its speed is 15 when it's incredibly low. It just doesn't make sense to call that a strength. The English translation of the Japanese term, shuzokuchi, is species values, which is better since it's more general and doesn't call something a strength that could potentially be a weakness. I still prefer base stats just because I've been using it for much longer. Honestly, if species values, not species strengths, was agreed upon first to be the preferred term for these numbers, I think I would have been fine with it. But like I said in the intro, once we are given an official name after we've already established a fan name to use in the Pokemon community, it just feels weird. So of course we're not going to like it. I still don't really understand why the Pokemon company does this though, because if anything, they should be grateful that people are talking about a certain concept enough to come up with a label for it. The only times that they have canonized fan terms were with Shiny and Evolution, terms I mentioned in the previous video, and even then, Evolutions have also recently been called VVs, so it really seems that Game Freak or the Pokemon Company or whoever is against canonizing fan terms. They just prefer to make worse official terminology. Next, we have IV and EV, which stand for individual value and effort value respectively. If you've ever played competitive Pokemon, you should be quite familiar with these terms, but since I know I have a decent amount of casual fans as well, here's a brief explanation as to what they are and why you would care about them. They are both values that contribute to the number that you see in a Pokemon's stat summary screen for their HP, attack, defense, special defense, and speed, and optimizing these numbers to be the way that you want is essential for having a good competitive Pokemon. Individual values are like a Pokemon's genetics that they were born with, while effort values are more like a Pokemon's training to have that stat increased. Individual values range from 0 to 31 for all stats, which cannot be changed except when a Pokemon is hyper-trained, where their non-31 IV can be boosted up to 31. For competitive battling, you typically want all 31 IVs except for the times where a lower stat is beneficial, like for a slow Pokemon to be used in Trick Room, where you would want a 0 IV. Effort values range from 0 to 252 for any one stat, with a maximum of 508 usable effort values across all stats for any one Pokemon. For competitive battling, you'd want to distribute these in stats that you'll use, which is most easily done by distributing 252 effort values in 2 stats and 4 in a third stat. For individual values, the official term is individual strengths, which is worse for the exact same reason I said for the last term. Don't call something a strength if it is not necessarily going to be a Pokemon's strength. The English translation of the Japanese term umaretsuki no tsuyosa is a little bit better, which translates to innate strengths, which still has the issue of using the word strengths, but it calls them innate, as if they were born with them, which makes sense since you cannot change these numbers. For effort values, the official term is base points, and from Fire Red Leaf Green to Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, it was base stats, which is the exact same name as the fan term for species strengths from the previous entry. Base stats is already an existing fan term for a different number, so why use that as the official name here? Base points isn't much better, as it implies that those points are inherent or cannot be changed, which they can. Sometimes, it honestly feels like the Pokemon Company actively hates its fans. Next, we have the term happiness. This is a fan term that refers to the level of attachment a Pokemon has with its trainer, which is represented by a hidden number from 0 to 255, 0 being the lowest, 255 being the highest. The official name is friendship, and this is really the only time where I don't really feel strongly about the fan terms, and I might actually prefer the official name. I feel like happiness implies that a Pokemon is happy within itself and doesn't really signify a relationship or connection with its trainer. Friendship, on the other hand, absolutely implies a relationship or connection, since you wouldn't really say that you have high friendship within yourself, but rather with another person or another being. This is also reflected in the way that this value is raised, which include but are not limited to washing your Pokemon, leveling them up, walking with them, and not having them faint in battle, as that reduces this value. The English translation of the Japanese term, natsuki, is emotional attachment, which in the context of a trainer and a Pokemon, I think friendship captures this idea pretty well. Other canonically used terms for friendship was being tame in Pokemon Stadium 2, having loyalty in Gold, Silver, and Crystal, friendliness in XD Gale of Darkness, and in Prima's official strategy guide for Gold and Silver, happiness was actually used. Since then though, friendship has been the preferred term. Friendship is different from affection, by the way, a concept exclusive to the Gen 6 and 7 games that was never really given a fan name, since the official name was always just affection since it was labeled that way in game. So that's all the fan terms I could find that do have official names that I didn't mention in the last video. Now onto fan terms that do not have official names, at least not yet, that are still used very commonly in the Pokemon community. A lot of these fan terms have multiple names, so I'll talk about all the names that I can find. First, we have the term Pikachu Clone. This is a fan term that refers to the evolutionary lines of Plusle, Minun, Pachirisu, Emolga, Dedenne, Togedemaru, Morpeko, and Pawmi. Unlike the group of pseudo-legendary or powerhouse Pokemon that I mentioned in the last video that have 3 specific criteria, being part of this group is more about shared design. They do have similar attributes though, such as being electric type, being part of the fairy or field egg groups, having names that are transliterations of their Japanese names, being able to learn the move Nuzzle, having abilities that make them immune to electric type moves, and having a 50-50 gender ratio. For their design, it is generally accepted by the Pokemon community that each one is meant to be a generation's version of Pikachu, arguably the single most iconic Pokemon of all time. They are all very small and lightweight, with all of them having circles on their cheeks. They are typically very weak in game, but very cute, making them great for selling plush dolls. They are all mostly based on rodents, with Pikachu's line, Plusle, and Minun being mice, Pachirisu being a squirrel, Emolga being a flying squirrel, Dedenne being a gerbil, Togedemaru mostly being a hedgehog, which is not a rodent, but also having chinchilla-like features, which is a rodent, Morpeko being a hamster, and the Pawmi line likely being marmots. Because of their common association with rodents, Electric Rodent is another name for this group, as well as Pikachu family, Pika Clone, Electric Mice, in the English translation of the Japanese name, Denki Bukurogumi, Electric Pouch Pokemon. It's interesting to note that Marill and Mimikyu are typically not included in this group, though some fans think they should be. Marill was once theorized to be called Pika Blue, but this was quickly confirmed to be incorrect. Mimikyu, on the other hand, is a ghost Pokemon that is literally pretending to be Pikachu, not a Pikachu clone. Many fans consider it to be more of a parody of the traditional Pikachu clone group, but I'm curious to see if you consider Mimikyu and even Meryl to be part of this group. Personally, I say no for both of them. Next, we have the term Convergent Form. This is a fan term that refers to the Pokemon and evolutionary lines of Pokemon that are very similar to each other, but not quite similar enough to be a regional variant of the same species. There are only 3 evolutionary lines that are considered convergent forms, all of them being introduced in Gen 9, which are Toedscruel, Wugtrio, and Sinistcha, being the convergent forms of Tentacruel, Dugtrio, and Poltegeist respectively. Their designs are similar enough that they could probably pass as regional variants, and they even have the same base stat total as, species strengths total as their convergent counterpart, except for Wiglet, which is 20 fewer than Diglett. They are distinct species though, all of them having their own names and own Pokedex numbers. Fans probably came up with this name from the concept of convergent evolution in biology, which I didn't know anything about before I made this video, so I'm not going to act like I'm an expert or anything, but a quick look on Wikipedia says that it's the process where different species of organisms in different periods of time develop similar traits. Insects, birds, and bats evolving to be capable of flight despite being vastly different organisms would be an example of convergent evolution. Fans also call these Pokemon ecologically similar, convergent species, or regional fakes. I don't really feel strongly about any of these fan terms, but if I had to pick, I'd probably just go with convergent form. Next, we have the term Early Route Pokemon. This is a fan term for the Pokemon that appear early on both in the story mode of the game and close to the beginning of the Pokedex for a given region or generation. Fans generally separate them into the 3 different types of animals that they are based off of: rodents, birds, and bugs, and another common name for them is regional rodent, regional bird, and regional bug. The rodents are usually normal or dark type, the birds are flying type, and the bugs are obviously bug type. The issue with rodent though is that some of the Pokemon are not really rodents. Bulbapedia suggests calling them vermin instead, which I think is better since it is wider encompassing of Pokemon that appear early on that are not rodents like Sentret, Bunnelby, Zigzagoon, Yungoos, and Lechonk. Now there are sometimes multiple early route Pokemon of the 3 different types of animals for a given region, and in Gen 9, some of them are unclear of if they actually count as early route Pokemon. Like is Gen 9's regional bird Squawkabilly or Wattrel, or neither? Squawkabilly appears earlier in the Pokedex, but Wattrel is part of an evolutionary line while Squawkabilly is not. Let me know what you think in the comments. Next, we have the term Game Mascot. This is a fan term for the Pokemon that appear on the official art for the game or pair of games. They are oftentimes called box art Pokemon, and since they are almost always legendary Pokemon, box art legendary is another common name for them. The only times where the Pokemon that appear on the box art of the game are not legendary Pokemon are all the Gen 1 games and Gen 1 remakes, where the Gen 1 starters, Pikachu, and Eevee are shown instead. In newer games, there are also box art Pokemon for DLC expansion passes, with Gen 8 having Urshifu and Calyrex, and Gen 9 having Ogerpon and Terapagos. Now it makes sense that these names wouldn't be used in Universe, because that would be fourth wall breaking. In Universe, there are no box arts or game mascots because we are in the game that they are from. It's also worth noting that there is an official name that is related but isn't always the same as a box art Pokemon or game mascot, which is Restricted Special Pokemon. Restricted Pokemon are what the Pokemon Company uses to call legendary Pokemon that can only be used in a specific VGC format, the official competitive format supported by the Pokemon Company. A lot of them are box art legendaries, but not necessarily, like Mewtwo and the Calyrex Riders. Some of the box art legendaries are also not restricted Pokemon, like Ogerpon and Suicune. Because restricted is a related but not exact match for what a game mascot is, I still feel it was worth mentioning, but should be excluded from the earlier section of the video. Lastly, we have the term HM Slay Mule. This is a fan term to describe a Pokemon that you only use for HMs. In case you're a newer Pokemon fan who hasn't played an old game that has them, HMs, or Hidden Machines, are teachable moves that you can use in battle, but they are mostly used for their overworld effects to progress the story mode of the game. Some of the moves are decent, but others are weak and just not moves that you would actually want to use in battle. Because of that, People will tend to reserve 1 or 2 Pokemon to learn all of these moves and only use them when they are needed to be used in the overworld to progress the game. These moves cannot be forgotten normally and can only be deleted by going to the Move Deleter NPC in the game. They got rid of them in Gen 7 and replaced them with Ride Pokemon, which I think was ultimately a good decision. Now, calling them a slave is obviously not the most appropriate thing to be referring to your Pokemon, which is supposed to be your close friend and ally, so Mule was the more appropriate term that Bulbapedia seems to suggest. And those are some more Pokemon fan terminology, and the official names for them were applicable. There were still a lot of terms I left out since I didn't want this video to be too long, so I suggest reading this Bulbapedia article if you want more. Thanks for watching.